Is there a differentiation between the military wing, the fighters in the tunnels, confronting, I have to be careful with my words here, but confronting the IDF in Gaza, compared to support for Hamas as a political entity? I can see the argument that people don't like Hamas's politics or they don't support the way it behaves and so on and so forth. We heard Anthony Blinken say around a year ago saying that Hamas has replenished all of the fighters that have been killed in their estimates, right? These guys that have joined since, for example, I would imagine the Gazans probably support those individuals in their individual resistance.
First of all, I wouldn't even trust Anthony Blinken to tell me what time it
Oh no,
is,
of
let
course, yeah,
alone anything.
yeah.
How long can Israel sustain this pattern before it begins to go into a process of collapse? And there's quite a lot of historical precedent, I think, for states such as Israel when they reach a level of extremism, of authoritarianism, and so on, a level of permanent enmity with their surroundings. Sooner or later, their days are numbered.
The bodies of the 9-month-old and the 4-year-old in a casket were put on a stage. They were then taken off the stage and handed over and, recorded and so on. How do you interpret those actions there? These are children who were killed. I'm not suggesting anyone should support these guys or anything like that, but you can at
Oh,
least
that's
sit.
right. You're contacting me from Britain. 1973 is a very good example where Israel, because of its hubris, because it was convinced that Arabs don't know how to fight wars, because it was persuaded that Egypt and Syria not only wouldn't be able to launch a surprise attack, but wouldn't dare to do so, that it neglected the information in its possession and decided not to act on it until it was too late. I think the attacks of October 7th are even more damning for Israel because Hamas managed to conceal its intentions and its preparations to a significantly greater extent. We're talking about what is arguably the most intensely surveyed territory, which is also the size of a postage stamp. Despite this, Israel was unable to connect the dots. And there, I think there will be a reckoning, both with Hamas and with Fatah and with the Palestinian national movement more generally, of how could we have had a situation in which the Palestinian movement was not unified, was not able to take a collective decision on matters of existential importance like war and peace, and this was left to one faction among many rather than being a collective decision, and what are the consequences of that? And then in the 1960s, after Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, it even reached an agreement with the Nazi regime, if you will, of the Stroessner regime of Paraguay, in which, in exchange for arms and diplomatic support, I think, Paraguay would accept something along the lines of 60,000 Gazans a year. And they actually began implementing this until a Palestinian who'd basically been promised the moon and realized he was getting nothing went and shot up the Israeli embassy in the Paraguayan capital, Asuncion. Then it ended. But
Moin, firstly, I wanted to say thank you, for giving me your time.
it's a pleasure to be with you.
If I may, can I ask you to introduce yourself? Whether it's accolades or academic background or career, how do you see yourself? Who are you to you?
Well, I'll keep it simple. I'm a political analyst specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East, and I write and comment widely on these topics.
Just to sort of set the tone of the background, can you give us a high-level, up-to-date summary as to where we're at with the current situation, specifically in Gaza, and then I guess just the general region there?
Well, I think what's happening in Gaza can be summed up in one word: genocide, and it's been ongoing since October of 2023, and that is taking place in the broader context of Israel's prolonged campaign, really since the origins of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, and particularly since the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948, to transform Palestine into not only a Jewish state, but an exclusively Jewish state, where the Jewish community in that territory is able to exercise undisputed political, demographic, and territorial hegemony to the exclusion of everyone else. Needless to say, this has bred uh, prolonged resistance from not only the direct victims, Palestinians, but also from the wider region. And what we've seen is that on October 7th, this resulted in a very significant attack on southern Israel led by Hamas, which resulted in over 1,000 Israeli casualties. Um, uh, Many of them, or mostly civilians, but also many soldiers and security personnel and so on. And Israel responded to that initially. Israel was thrown off balance, it was caught with its pants down. And its initial response was to use its overwhelming power and military advantage to engage in a genocidal campaign of revenge and bloodlust, which we've been seeing on our television screens for almost 2 years. But what happened last summer is that by that time, Israel appears to have regained sufficient confidence, not least because of unconditional US and more broadly Western support, which far exceeded even what Israel expected it would receive, to try to remake the region, to try to alter the strategic balance, the balance of power in the region for a generation or more. And in that context, we saw it go on the offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon, against the Houthis in Yemen, to intensify its attacks against Syria, and most recently with the unprovoked war of aggression that it launched against Iran. And if you look at it, if you take a snapshot today, it certainly looks like Israel has the upper hand. It has largely reduced the Gaza Strip to rubble. It is engaging in the greatest mass displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank since the occupation began in 1967. It has significantly weakened Hezbollah. The outcome of its direct confrontation with Iran is somewhat less clear because Israel was also, had to absorb significant blows from Iranian missiles. In Yemen, the Houthis are still firing drones and missiles at Israel, and more importantly, preventing passage of shipping headed towards Israel through Bab el Mandeb that connects the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea. But the long and short of it is, again, if you take a snapshot today, it certainly would appear that Israel holds an undisputed advantage over its rivals, its adversaries, and its enemies. But it raises a more profound question that you now have a state and a society that's living in a state of permanent warfare with the region, with its environment, and has chosen to dominate its environment through military force rather than seeking coexistence with them by recognizing their rights and allowing them to exercise those rights. And then I think that raises a broader, more long term question that Israel is a relatively small state, it's a relatively small society. It is able to act as it does because of the unrestricted and unconditional support that it receives from Western countries, and particularly the United States. But they're not doing this altruistically. They're doing this because, whether you agree or not, they believe that Israel is serving their interests. And when you have an overstretched military, an overstretched economy, an increasingly exhausted society, the question becomes how long can Israel sustain this pattern before it begins to go into a process of collapse. And there's quite a lot of historical precedent, I think, for states such as Israel when they reach a level of extremism, of authoritarianism, and so on, a level of permanent enmity with their surroundings. That sooner or later their days are numbered.
Moin, I smile slightly just because I spent a lot of time writing down what I've got here, and you've hit quite a few of the questions there already. You mentioned in your opinion, as an analyst, I'm taking it that Israel was caught off guard with October 7th. So
Yes.
it okay. That's, I find that interesting because there are those who also say, they took 6 hours to respond. There was information beforehand, and this kind of speculation of possibly kind of letting something. They knew something was going to happen. And people have been called anti-Semitic for even postulating this. But then I do believe, I'll try and put the references up on screen, there are some credible sources that there was some level of information at some point. What would you make of those two things?
Yeah, I don't think that's anti-Semitic, but it does strike
No,
me as
agreed.
as an untenable conspiracy theory, if you will. A good analogy would be the October 1973 war. In October 1973, Israel had clear information in its possession that Egypt and Syria planned to initiate a joint offensive to recover the territories, the Syrian and Egyptian territories that Israel had occupied in 1967. He even had a double agent planted in the highest levels of the Egyptian leadership
There's a
who
famous
gave it.
documentary about him, right? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, yes, Ashraf Marwan, who gave them specific information about the incoming attack. The problem was that Israel was ideologically predisposed to reject the relevance of such information. So just because you or I, think of it, just because you or I know there's a risk of driving, 180 kilometers an hour down the highway, um, doesn't mean we're not going to do it, and it doesn't mean that if you then cause or are involved in a very severe car accident, that somehow you didn't know this was the case. So I mean, it's a bit maybe a poor analogy, but the point I'm trying to make is there's a fundamental difference between having information in your possession and then being able to process it properly
Right.
and take the appropriate decisions. 1973 is a very good example where Israel, because of its hubris, because it was convinced that Arabs don't know how to fight wars, because it was persuaded that Egypt and Syria would never be able to launch, not only wouldn't be able to launch a surprise attack on Israel, but wouldn't dare to do so, that it neglected the information in its possession and decided not to act on it until it was too late. I think the attacks of October 7th are even more damning for Israel because
Right.
Hamas managed to conceal its intentions and its preparations to a significantly greater extent. We're not talking about two conventional armies massing on the borders of occupied territories controlled by Israel. We're talking about what is arguably the most intensely surveyed territory, which is also, has the size of a postage stamp. And despite this, Israel was unable to connect the dots. We later learned that part of this is complacency, part of this is an over reliance on technology rather than human information. And a significant part of it, it turns out, was because Israel had devoted its best intelligence resources not to the Gaza Strip, where it was convinced once again that Hamas had other priorities it wouldn't dare, and so on, and therefore had devoted its best intelligence services not to the potential threat coming from the Gaza Strip, but what it viewed as the very real threat that existed in Lebanon, namely that of Hezbollah. It is true, that Israel, very late in the day, I think only hours before, received more concrete warnings,
I
and
think it was
these
early
were.
hours of that morning.
Yes, and these were signals or images or whatever they were that were observed by kind of junior intelligence officers stationed around the Gaza Strip, and they sent them up the food chain. And then more senior officers decided that these were not serious indications of an imminent attack and decided to ignore them. That, to me, is not evidence that Israel knew what was happening. decided to allow it to happen so that it could later take advantage of what it of the attacks in its
It's
response. Of course,
hubris, as you say.
yes, it's hubris, complacency, and in this particular case, I think one should also add incompetence. I mean, Israel was convinced, that it actually reduced its deployments in the region of the Gaza Strip. People have said, well, that's because it was being ruled by an extremist government that decided to focus on the West Bank and settlement expansion and so on. That's only partially true. As I was mentioning earlier, Israel is a relatively small state, with a relatively small society. And it decided that technology could do the job of multiple soldiers and intelligence officers. And this over reliance on technological solutions was, I think, part of its failures on October 7th.
Since October 7th, I've heard a lot about support for Hamas, specifically within Gaza. That's something really hard to ascertain at the moment, and since, given the situation. You hear both sides so often. I've heard leaders in Hamas say, no, we have the popular support. Yes, there are those who don't support us, but we have sort of the mandate, we were voted in. And then there are those who say, these are all quote unquote pro Palestinian, but they will say, actually, most of the Gazans, this was 20 years ago, and most of them oppose Hamas, and Hamas is a brutal regime, and so on and so forth. I've often just had this query in my head: is there a differentiation between the military wing, the fighters in the tunnels, confronting? I have to be careful with my words here, but confronting the IDF in Gaza, compared to support for Hamas as a political entity? Because I can see the argument that people don't like Hamas's politics, or they don't support the way it behaves, and so on and so forth. But we heard Anthony Blinken say around a year ago, saying that Hamas has replenished all of the fighters that have been killed in their estimates, right? These guys that have joined since, for example, they've been a part of the military wing for 12 months. Just for example, that'll apply to many of them. I would imagine the Gazans probably support those individuals in their individual resistance, largely. What would you make of that? What do you think
Well,
of that?
I first of all, I wouldn't even trust Anthony Blinken to tell me what time it
Oh no,
is,
of
let
course, yeah,
alone anything.
yeah, it's
He may have been basing a statement on intelligence reports that he received from U.S. and Israeli intelligence. He may have been making the statement to put forward a justification for Israel continuing its genocidal military campaign. So I don't think you can take anything this guy has ever said or will ever say with more than a grain of salt. Look, regarding Hamas, let's go back to 2006 when you had the legislative elections and Hamas won those, and it won those with a veto proof majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council, the PA parliament that represents Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, what people often forget is that they won such a large majority, not because they won a majority of the votes. They, in fact, only won a plurality of the votes. And for example, in Rafah, Fatah won most of the seats there, if I'm not mistaken. They won. They won those elections for two reasons. The first is because of the electoral system that existed, and the second is because their main rivals, Fatah, could not agree on a unified list of candidates. So the Fatah vote was split between two or more electoral lists in the various voting districts. And this allowed Hamas to repeatedly win parliamentary seats without winning absolute majority in many of those electoral districts. Nevertheless, it did win those elections fair and square. The Carter Center at the time said they're, I believe, among the freest and fairest elections that they had observed. And then you began to see a situation where, on the one hand, Fatah movement basically taking the position, we've controlled this political system for over 40 years. We're certainly not going to relinquish it just because we lost one election. Whereas Hamas took the decision of, well, we've won the election, so whatever happened before it is somehow irrelevant. And this rivalry intensified. And in 2007, Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip. In its view, and I think this is largely borne out by the evidence, it was a preemptive coup because they were facing an imminent effort to dislodge them from power, sponsored by the United States and some of their Palestinian rivals. And initially, Hamas's popularity actually increased because it was able to restore law and order in an increasingly lawless Gaza Strip, and so on. But over the years, I think the combination of the blockade that was seen as directly related to Hamas's continuing hegemonic control over the Gaza Strip, coupled with its increasingly authoritarian and repressive pattern of rule, had seriously diminished their popularity in the Gaza Strip. And the conventional wisdom until a few years ago used to be that if there were new Palestinian elections, Fatah would win in the Gaza Strip and Hamas would win in the West Bank. In other words, there was equal disillusionment with the rule of the Palestinian Authority and specifically of the PA president, Mahmoud Abbas, in the West Bank. I think that began to change somewhat in the last year or two before October 2023. I think that there was a general view in the Gaza Strip that they had the popular view that the Gaza Strip had essentially been forfeited and abandoned by the Palestinian Authority, and especially by Abbas. And also, the PA began to be seen as so corrupt and illegitimate that Hamas would have probably cleaned up in any new elections. This time, perhaps even with a real majority rather than a plurality. And then came October 7th. And I think initially, with Israel characterizing this as the most severe attack that had been launched on the state since it was established in 1948, I think that gave it a lot of credit among Palestinians, that it was capable of doing something that, according to Israel, exceeded even anything that a combination of the Arab world's most powerful states have been able to inflict on Israel. And this caused its stock to skyrocket among Palestinians and among Arabs more generally. Now, of course, you've had almost 2 years of genocide. And I think your characterization is probably a fair one, that people distinguish between Hamas as a political movement or political leadership on the one hand, and its fighters on the other, who perhaps they relate to in more personal terms. These are our sons, these are our neighbors, and so on. And so I think to the extent that there is criticism or opposition, it is directed primarily at Hamas as a movement and at its political leadership rather than at its military formations, the Qassam brigades, and so on. Now, I've seen a lot of the polling. I don't know to what extent it's reliable because I think in situations of crisis, public opinion polling is always going to be suspicious because it reflects kind of the immediate situation people are in. So one looks at it more for long-term trends. But my assumption would be that the popularity of Hamas has decreased. I would not be surprised to learn that it has in fact decreased significantly in the Gaza Strip for obvious reasons. But at the same time, it appears to have increased by the same proportion among Palestinians in the West Bank and in exile. So overall, I think it's a mixed picture. I think the question becomes, what will be the respective position of Hamas and of Fatah and of other Palestinian movements, um, after this whole catastrophe comes to an end. And there, I think there will be a reckoning, both with Hamas and with Fatah and with the Palestinian national movement more generally, of how could we have had a situation in which the Palestinian movement was not unified, was not able to take a collective decision on matters of existential importance like war and peace. And this was left to one faction among many rather than being a collective decision. And what are the consequences of that? Those questions are to a certain extent already being asked, but I think they will become much louder and more demanding in the aftermath of this genocide.
Just to double check there, where you mentioned you believe Hamas's popularity is more than likely reduced in Gaza and increased in the West Bank, is that the political wing specifically, as in the Hamas as an overall entity?
Yes, and again, that's my sense of things. That's my assumption.
Yeah.
I'm not basing that on any particular scientific knowledge, so to speak.
We've had October 7th, for example, and we had people like, say, Professor Finkelstein, who, rather than just straight up condemning this killing and so on, he gave context to images and videos and explained how one can interpret them and what has actually happened here. And it's not necessarily a case of ISIS terrorists, or, all of this straight away, right? This is all done in an attempt to understand the people and what they did, right? With the Bibas family specifically, the hostage handover, and I'll share on the screen for the viewers and yourself in a second. This I just can't understand what the thinking might have been within Hamas. And I know you know a lot of their background, and perhaps you can tell us how much you feel you'd understand how they make decisions and so on. The bodies of the 9-month-old and the 4-year-old in a casket were put on a stage, and there was a bit of, I'm not sure what the right word to use is, but Western media has referred to it as like a ceremony, right? They were then taken off the stage and handed over and recorded and so on. How do you interpret those actions there? These are children who were killed, and it wasn't actually by Hamas. Again, I'll drop the link below. It wasn't actually by Hamas. I mentioned it in a previous interview. How do you? Sorry for my sort of convoluted question there, but how do you interpret such actions? Surely Hamas would have at least approved of this process, if not planned it themselves. This particular handover.
Well, the handover was conducted by Hamas. My understanding is that the seizure of these three civilians was not done by Hamas, and they were later either in Hamas captivity or others. And the Palestinian claim is that they were killed in an Israeli bombing. The Israelis have claimed that they were murdered while in captivity, which not only contradicts everything one would expect Hamas to do, in the sense that it was seeking to maximize the number of Palestinian captives who would be released in exchange for them, but also, for example, the pathology report, to the best of my understanding, has not been released. No foreign pathologists were allowed to attend the inquest and so on. But to get back to your question, in every exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians, those that took place in November 2023, and more recently, Hamas has always released its captives in a kind of public ceremony, making something of a spectacle out of it, to send a clear political message that, we're still here, we're organized, we can organize, stage these ceremonies by having our fighters and bringing the captives up on stage. And it's also, I think, to send a clear message to the Israelis of, we're still capable of releasing one captive in the southern Gaza Strip in one day, another in the central area in the second day, and a third in the northern Gaza Strip on the third day. So they're trying to send various political messages with these. And in this case, they were also staging these public ceremonies for the handover of captives who were no longer alive. And what happened here is you had this mother and her two children who Hamas has insisted were killed in an Israeli bombing, and then staged a similar handover for their bodies. And I think from Hamas's perspective, they were probably thinking, were motivated by the same thoughts that they had applied to all the previous handovers. But of course, it caused quite a bit of outrage, not only in Israel but elsewhere as well. That Hamas was somehow celebrating as a victory, let's say, its handover of the corpses of two children and their mother. So there's just a complete disconnect here, I think, between what Hamas was seeking to achieve and how it was interpreted, not only in Israel but by much of the rest of the world. And I think it was on that basis that the Israelis are now insisting that in any further exchange of captives, that Hamas not hold any public ceremony, whether it concerns the release of captives who are still living, or their bodies, because of course, anytime Hamas is able to stage one of these ceremonies, it's sending a message of strength and coherence, if you will, to Israel. But obviously, parading around, well, putting these coffins of these two young children and their mother on stage was very much an own goal.
Yeah. So would you say that specific instance with the two children it kind of backfired in terms of PR?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's what one only has to read and listen to what
Mm.
was said about it, precisely by those Hamas was hoping to influence by staging the
Okay.
handover in this way.
Okay. Who?
If
Sorry.
you sorry to interrupt you, if you look
No, of
at
course, please.
previous instances, you read the Israeli press, and they would point out that on the one hand, our leaders are telling us that they have crushed this movement and obliterated its ability to act coherently. Yet they're making a point of, in an organized fashion, releasing our captives in different locations on different days and doing it in an orderly fashion. And then you look at the same response to the release of the coffins of these three civilians, and it was a very different response. So definitely it backfired. Yes.
When you say the audience that they were doing this for, you mentioned Israel. Do you think Hamas pay much attention or care much about the wider Western sort of PR situation? How people say in America and the UK and so on view them,
Yeah, I do think they care,
or how much
because
value do you think they attribute to
well,
it?
I
Sorry.
think I think they attribute quite a lot of value to it because they understand that these are countries that have real influence. They understand if the US president decides that this genocide should end, it will take no more than a phone call to the Israeli prime minister to bring it to an end. I mean, they have a very good understanding of how the world works. But having said that, if you're talking about PR, if you're talking about propaganda, it's been my impression that Hamas propaganda is primarily directed at seeking to mobilize their own people, Palestinians, behind them, and secondarily, in seeking to wage psychological warfare, if you will, against Israel. They
Okay.
have expended much less effort and are much less adept in propaganda directed specifically at Western audiences.
Why is that?
I think
If the
you know
levers of power are are in the US, because if I can just add a slight question
yeah.
onto that, we had like the Iranian president recently on Tucker Carlson, for example. You had okay, maybe Nasrullah is not the best example because he didn't really do anything in English, but he gave out long, lengthy speeches that you can sit through the translation with. I'm not suggesting anyone should support these guys or anything like that, but you can at
Oh,
least
that's
sit.
right. You're contacting me from Britain. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't anyway, to be honest with
Mm.
you, but it's you can at least listen and hear the perspective. I at least want to know why you're doing what you're doing and so on, you know. But
Mm.
there isn't really that. There is no connection there because, as you say, most of the information they put out, anything we hear about Hamas is from a Westerner, really.
Yes.
Anything we hear about Hezbollah is from a Westerner. And they may be terrible organizations. I'm not saying otherwise necessarily, but I'd like to hear from individuals why they're doing what they're doing. And if they are, if their sentiments are true and holy, so to speak, then it will be useful for them to put that out in, say, English media, as you say, like the levers of power in the US, for
Well, I mean,
example.
they do accept interviews with Western media. They have translated some of their documents into English. I believe in November of 23, or maybe it was later, they put out a statement in which they sought to explain and justify the 7 October attacks. And I believe it was Hamas itself
Yeah, I
that
think it was. Yeah.
translated into English and put it out. But again, historically, Hamas propaganda has been very much focused on generating and mobilizing Palestinian support for the movement, or arguably broader Arab support as well. And secondarily, following a model, I think, that was very much established by Hezbollah during the 1990s of using propaganda as a weapon of psychological warfare against Israel by seeking to influence Israeli public opinion, seeking to demonstrate to the Israeli public that their own leadership is lying to them and is not telling them the truth and is trying to conceal things and so on. And more broadly, while Hamas, it doesn't, for example, reject interview requests from Western journalists, and it does publish some things in English. It has never prioritized a propaganda campaign in the West. I don't think this is a question of limited resources. I think just think I it's my impression that the movement considers the mobilization of Palestinian support its priority, and its psychological warfare in the context of Israel its second priority. And although I presume that it would like to be able to influence um, Western public opinion and Western elites to a greater extent than it is able to, of course. I haven't seen the evidence that it is investing particularly significant resources in that direction. And maybe, perhaps, it feels that these are things perhaps best left to others.
It just takes a conversation, though. One of them could just sit there for 30 minutes and just explain. Honestly, look, we've been battered for these many
Well, I
years.
mean,
We've had this.
if you talk about their media, for example, the television stations and the radio and the newspapers and so on, those were all in Arabic. And they haven't, for example, sought to produce programs in English or German or Russian or whatever. And I think probably, they again, it's not as if they have shunned Western media. Um, they're certainly made themselves available to them over the years, but they just haven't dealt with it as if it is a priority. Um, Perhaps they do consider it more important than their activities would lead one to suggest, but I haven't seen the evidence that they have prioritized um, an information campaign in the West.
Changing the subject slightly, the expulsion and potential annexation, in Gaza. Open-ended question: is this as an analyst, do you see this potentially as an inevitability now? Gaza's massively flattened.
Mhm.
I think it's like 80% or something of the buildings, damaged and destroyed. It's been almost 2 years that Israel's been on this absolute raising Gaza to the ground, as they say. Personally, as a layman, I, perhaps wrongly, hopefully, I cannot imagine in any situation Israel allowing reconstruction, inside of Gaza.
Well, um, the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip is certainly an Israeli strategic objective. I mean, virtually every Israeli leader has said as much during the past 2 years. And this has a history. It's often forgotten. Gaza City may be one of the world's oldest cities, but the Gaza Strip did not exist before 1948. It came into being as a result of the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist militias and later the nascent Israeli army during the Palestine War, as it's called, of 1947, 1949. And what happened is you had a local population, pre-war population of 80,000, suddenly augmented by over 200,000 dispossessed and destitute refugees in the 1% of mandatory Palestine that remained under Arab control, in this case under Egyptian administration, a small strip of land in the southwestern corner of coastal Palestine. That's how the Gaza Strip got its name, because of its shape. Um, and then, eventually, 8 refugee camps were established in the Gaza Strip, and so from the outset, the Gaza Strip has been one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, and its refugee camps were arguably the most densely populated pockets in the world. Now, Israel, from very early on, from the 1950s, has been very uncomfortable with the idea of these hundreds of thousands of dispossessed, stateless, embittered refugees sitting right across its borders, often within spitting distance of their homes from which they had been expelled and to which they were being prevented from returning by armed force. And so from the very outset, Israel began putting forward proposals to achieve what it called thinning out the population of the Gaza Strip, reducing the population of the Gaza Strip, and reducing in particular the refugee population of the Gaza Strip. And it put forward all kinds of proposals, move them to the Sinai Desert in Egypt, move them to Libya, move them to Iraq, move them to I don't know where. And then in the 1960s, after Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, it even reached an agreement with the Nazi regime, if you will, of the Stroessner regime of Paraguay, in which, in exchange for arms and diplomatic support, I think, Paraguay would accept something along the lines of 60,000 Gazans a year. And they actually began implementing this until a Palestinian who'd basically been promised the moon and realized he was getting nothing went and shot up the Israeli embassy in the Paraguayan capital, Asuncion, and then it ended. But what you saw is that during beginning in the 1980s, really, this idea of the mass forcible transfer of Palestinians from the occupied territories and even from within Israel itself became kind of the preserve of the far right in Israeli politics. And it largely, excuse me, and it largely fell from view. At least it was no longer publicly discussed in Israeli polite society and mainstream politics. Then on October 7th, all of a sudden, overnight, it once again became government policy and more or less the Israeli national consensus. And then you had this February, the newly installed US President, Donald Trump, putting forward this harebrained Gaza Riviera scheme, whereby the entire population is permanently expelled from the Gaza Strip so that he could build whatever in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, um, already in late 2023, the former US administration tried to market a similar proposal to the Arab states, whereby the population of the Gaza Strip would be forcibly relocated to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. And in both cases, the Arab governments collectively and individually rejected these proposals because they viewed it not only as a national security threat, but also as a direct threat to their domestic stability and to what remains of their regime legitimacy. So the kind of orderly, mass forcible transfer of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Egypt and eventually from the West Bank to Jordan, I wouldn't exclude it categorically, but I don't see it happening. I think what we're much more likely to see, at least as far as Israeli intentions is concerned, is a situation more akin to that which we had in Syria during the 2010s, where you had this brutal civil war, economic collapse, and all the rest of it. And in the absence of a government decision to expel the population from the country, growing numbers of people living in conditions they considered intolerable, either because of the violence or because of the economic crisis or a combination of the two or whatever, began upping sticks and leaving, in Israeli parlance, making the Gaza Strip unlivable and leaving people with no choice but to leave in order to survive. That's something they call voluntary transfer.
Yeah.
And I see a situation like that in which people basically climb into dinghies hoping to get to Cyprus or whatever as much more likely. The difference between Palestine and Syria, of course, is that in Syria, people who could leave left knowing that they could return to their country. In Palestine, it's a one way ticket. Once you leave, you'll never be allowed to return by the Israelis. And so we'll have to see to what extent that inhibits people who would otherwise respond to a horrible situation similar to the way Syrians have, that they may be inhibited from doing what they would otherwise feel they have no choice left but to do.
I would imagine a lot of Gazans would leave.
Well, a lot of, I'm sure a lot would
I know
leave.
I would in a heartbeat, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to make any judgment here, but I can't imagine. I mean, how. And my point here being, Israel probably doesn't need them all to leave in order to actually kind
No,
of annex the land, you know,
I
in
mean,
terms of a
Israel doesn't
population.
require every last Palestinian from the Gaza Strip to be expelled from the country. It is seeking a very substantial reduction of the population. It didn't expel every last Palestinian from the areas of Palestine that came under its rule in 1948, but it expelled enough of them that it was able to transform Palestine into an exclusively Jewish state. And so here again, if it can get rid of half, 70, 80% of the population, from Israel's perspective, that would be an excellent start. Israel also has patience. This doesn't need to happen tomorrow morning. If over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, growing numbers leave, that's good enough for Israel. The question is, how many will be able to leave, and how many of those who are able to leave will feel inhibited by a political situation in which they are not only facing extraordinarily difficult circumstances at home, but unlike Syrians, also understand that if they do leave, they will not be able to return. And those, I think, are unanswered questions.
But if you're left in a predicament where there is, you know, there will be no reconstruction and so on, hopefully wrongly feel over time it's just a case of the Israelis are just squeezing and squeezing, and once the population's down to a certain amount, it's disgusting to use this kind of language, but almost absorb it, you know, into, you know, and it's not a demographic threat necessarily.
Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, but then you
I mean, I
look
hope
at
that's not what happens, but
you
yeah.
look at the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and those certainly haven't been absorbed and co-opted into Israeli society. I mean, they're citizens and all the rest of it, but as an exclusively Jewish state, Israel is unable to absorb them the way that, for example, Great Britain has absorbed immigrants into its national fabric.
Just a question before the last.
Mhm.
Appreciate your time. Just on this note, in a previous interview, I know you mentioned recently actually, Israel would likely remove Palestinian Arabs from within Israel as well.
Well, that was in the context of the of the war against Iran.
Okay,
So you have these extreme right parties in Israel, some of whom are now part of the governing coalition and whose leaders hold among the most senior government portfolios, and also others in the opposition that are represented in the Israeli parliament. And their calls for the expulsion of Palestinians from the territories under Israeli rule are not limited to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or even to those in the West Bank, but also include calls for the expulsion of Palestinian citizens from Israel. And the point I was making is that it was not inconceivable that if the war against Iran escalated and basically set the entire region on fire, that under cover of such a regional and potentially international crisis, that Israel would feel empowered to take extreme measures.
but this was my question there because that scenario that you lay out could well still take place, right?
It's
There is
conceivable,
there is a
yes.
ceasefire with Iran at the moment, but God knows what might happen tomorrow. What would the mechanism be? What would the pretext be? How would
Trucks,
how
I don't know, buses. I have no
would you
idea.
just go? They would
Maybe.
just throw people onto trucks and ship them out.
Well,
Surely,
again, I'm talking about an extreme scenario
yeah.
um, uh, in which you have a generalized regional conflict, and in
Right.
which
Okay.
Israel is able to successfully convince not only its own public, but also its supporters that the continued presence of this population group represents a dangerous fifth column and is acting on behalf of a foreign enemy threatening the very existence of the state and so on, and is then able to begin expelling them outside the borders of the state. I wasn't putting this forward as a likely scenario,
Sure. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but as a possibility in in a situation of extreme regional conflict.
Okay. Just my last sort of question then, Moin. So you're a political analyst. Is that the right uh, term to use?
Sure. Mm.
Yeah. What can you just briefly highlight for us what exactly that entails?
I mean, very simple. It's not science. It consists of having opinions on developments in the region based on your knowledge of realities. And as an analyst, I can put forward one opinion, and you can put forward a entirely contradictory one, and one or both of us could be proven wrong or right by subsequent developments. This isn't physics or mathematics where there's only one correct answer to a particular challenge, but it does require a certain basic level of knowledge about reality and a certain basic level of common sense.
Yeah, because I asked this because myself as an example, and probably people watching, you know, uh, we don't have sort of a formal experience like yourself, but we're almost, correct me, if I'm wrong here at all, but we're almost analyzing things ourselves. And with the day and age which we live in, there is just so much information. If I sat here in honesty, I feel like five different sides could convince me that they're right. You know,
Well, and
God
that's
forbid I might be pro-Israeli in a multiverse or something. No,
well,
maybe
I
that's too
this,
far. But how do you how sorry to cut you off. How can I get some advice? Essentially, is what I'm asking. How does the average person stay true to the facts with so much information, so much disinformation? I guess. How do you do it? I mean, you do it as a job, effectively, right?
well, the difference between you and your grandfather is that, if your grandfather wanted to learn about a particular situation, he would have to go to the library to read physical books, or, he would have to go to the store and buy a newspaper to read through it, or a magazine, or, or actually go speak to people. Now you can do much of the research, without without leaving your room, because you can do it on your laptop, or even on your tablet, or on your phone. But the principles remain the same. Yes, you can do much more now from your own home than you could previously, but the underlying principles that you have to learn to distinguish between credible sources and information, and sources and information that are not credible remains the same. I would you accept my views on particle physics or on oncology? Of course not. Because I know nothing about them, and if I start spouting all kinds of theories about them, you would do well to dismiss them out of hand.
But
And it's,
I wouldn't know. To be honest, that's the thing.
well,
I
you would
personally
know.
wouldn't.
You would know.
Okay.
I mean, if the things that I say sound bizarre, and then you begin looking into my background, and you find out I don't even know how to spell oncology, then you would know not to take what I say about the topic seriously. So, it's a skill that's acquired over time, learning to sift through different sources of information. If something sounds doesn't sound right, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It means it's probably wrong, but you do that by looking further into the sources of the information, the credibility of the people providing the information, and so on.
Okay, but I feel like it is almost forgivable to have the average person just listening and doing a routine amount of listening and thinking and so on to be convinced by the other side, so to speak. And I feel like they're not necessarily being disingenuous. It's just so difficult to navigate these things because the example you gave was if you say something about physics and it sounds a bit odd and so on. But actually, if you listen to some of the arguments for like humanitarian aid and the situation, we've given out 14 million, you know, meals, and it's Hamas. They want control. Why is one of the key sticking points on the ceasefire that the UN must uh, uh, control the food flow as well?
Well,
It sounds like
experience,
an
yeah,
argument,
it
So,
sounds very credible, but if you're
so you
sufficiently,
don't jump up and say, "Oh, that sounds odd. I'm going to look into it."
yes,
For
of
cut you off,
course. I
for
mean, if
example,
if
then.
if you're sufficiently experienced, you learn to be skeptical whenever anyone, Israeli, Palestinian, American, whatever, makes a statement that seems to fully validate their own political agenda. So, in this particular case, you have this organization claiming they've given out, I don't know how many millions of meals. Well, you look into it and you find out they're pulling the number out of thin air, because has it been independently verified? No, it hasn't. And then you look at other credible sources who will all tell you this is the sole source of this figure is the organization providing it, and no one has been able to verify it. So, experience in dealing with information, of course, helps as well. And the only way you're going to get experienced in dealing with information is to constantly apply yourself to the issue.
So it sounds like it's quite the undertaking then.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the difference between dealing with a situation like the Gaza genocide, and dealing with astrophysics, is that in this case, you basically, your key tools are common sense, a lack, common sense, basic morality, and a willingness to learn, and the time to pursue information and to absorb information.
Okay, awesome. Moin, I know you've got a book coming out. This will get maybe 1 million views, so you might want to shout it out. Is it called it's Gaza's Apocalypse, right?
Gaza Apocalypse: Causes and Consequences.
You can pre-order it on Amazon, and it's coming out on the 27th of January 2026.
Yes, OR Books and is a publisher.
And you've got a podcast that I'll link below as well called Connections, where you deal with
Correct.
issues in the Middle East. And you also do a weekly uh, podcast, would you call it, or
Yeah,
conversation
that's
on
one
Middle
where
East
I'm
tonight.
interviewed by Nassim Ahmed of Middle East Monitor, and it's called This Week in Palestine.
I'll link them below as well if people want
Thank
to check
you.
them out. Thank you for bearing with me and for answering my questions.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise.
Bye.